A man gets a gift. One robe. Red, soft, expensive. The kind of thing he never could have afforded a year earlier. Within a few months, his house is unrecognizable. His furniture's gone. His artwork is gone. His money is gone. And he is sitting in a study that is, by every external measure, more beautiful than it has ever been in his life, writing the most miserable essay he will ever publish. This is the Diderot Effect, and almost everyone who talks about it online gets the actual mechanism completely wrong. They'll tell you it's about advertising, about influencers, about capitalism whispering in your ear until you buy a candle that matches your couch. That is not what happened to the man this effect is named after. There were no ads in his story, no salesman, no billboard. Nobody was selling him anything at all. What destroyed him came from somewhere far closer to home. It came from inside his own head. And once you understand the actual mechanism, you'll start noticing it has been quietly running your life for years. Let's start with the man. Denis Diderot, one of the sharpest minds of the French Enlightenment, the editor behind the Encyclopédie, a project so massive and so controversial it got him thrown in prison and nearly bankrupted him twice over. By 1765, he was 52 years old, brilliant, famous across Europe, and almost completely broke. His daughter was getting married and he had no way to pay for it, so he made the only move available to a man with nothing left to sell but his books. He put his personal library, 3,000 volumes collected over a lifetime, up for sale. Word reached Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia. She bought the entire library for 15,000 livres, more money than Diderot had likely held in his hands at one time in his entire life. And then, almost as an afterthought, she added an annual salary on top of it, naming him her own librarian and letting him keep every single book in his house until he died. Overnight, a man who had spent his whole life being clever and poor became clever and comfortable. And it is at this exact moment, flush with unexpected wealth, that someone gave Denis Diderot a present. A new dressing gown. Scarlet red, luxurious, soft as anything he had ever worn. And this is where the story should end. A poor man gets rich. A rich man gets a nice robe. Roll credits. Instead, it became one of the strangest essays in the history of Western philosophy, and almost 3 centuries later, it explains something deeply uncomfortable about the way your brain works right now. Diderot put the robe on, and it was perfect. Better than perfect. It fit him exactly, moved with him, looked nothing short of magnificent. And then he looked around his study. He'd been living in that room for years, surrounded by the same battered furniture, completely at peace with it. A straw chair he'd had forever. A plain wooden desk, scarred and ink-stained from decades of writing. A worn-out rug. A bookshelf made from a plank of wood balanced on whatever would hold it up. Cheap prints hanging crooked on the wall. None of it had ever bothered him for a single day. He wrote some of the most influential philosophy in European history, sitting in that exact mess. And now, with this one absurdly elegant robe draped over his shoulders, every single object in that room looked, in his own words, wrong. So he started replacing things. First, the straw chair went, swapped for one covered in leather. Then the desk. Then the bookshelf, traded up for an actual armoire with proper inlay. The rug got replaced with one shipped in from Damascus. The cheap smoky prints came down, and a real painting went up in their place. A new mirror appeared above the mantel. One by one, every object that had quietly, peacefully coexisted with him for years was identified as inadequate and removed. He wrote afterward that his old possessions had formed in their shabbiness what he called the most harmonious indigence. Everything matched because everything was equally worn. The moment he introduced one object that didn't belong to that harmony, the entire room turned, in his words, discordant. And here's the part that should genuinely catch you off guard. Diderot was miserable about it, not proud, not satisfied. He wrote, almost confused at his own behavior, "I was the absolute master of my old dressing gown, but I've become a slave to my new one." He cursed the day he ever owned anything beautiful. He wrote that poverty has its freedoms, and that wealth, his new wealth, the wealth that should have made his life easier, had brought nothing but obstacles he had personally invented and then walked directly into. A man got everything he could have reasonably wanted. More money, better things, a beautiful room. And he ended up writing an essay that reads less like gratitude and more like a warning label. Before we get into the actual science, let's just admit something. You have absolutely done this. Maybe not with a scarlet robe and a fortune from an empress, but you've done a version of it. You buy one nice candle, and suddenly the other candles in the house look like they were rescued from a gas station fire. You get a single good pillow, and now the couch looks like it's been through a custody battle. Somebody buys a new phone case, and within the week, they're staring at their cracked charger cable like it personally betrayed them. None of that is a coincidence, and Diderot wouldn't have found it surprising either. He'd probably just nod, sip something expensive, and say, "Yes, welcome. I tried to warn you in 1769. For roughly 2 centuries, that essay sat there as a strange little curiosity in French literature, occasionally quoted, mostly ignored. Then, in 1986, an anthropologist studying consumer behavior named Grant McCracken picked it apart and realized Diderot had accidentally documented something far bigger than one man's bad week with home decor. McCracken named the pattern after him, the Diderot Effect. The basic version most people know goes something like this. Buy one new thing, and suddenly the things around it look outdated, which makes you buy something else to match, which makes something else look outdated, and the cycle just keeps climbing. New shoes make the rest of your wardrobe look tired. A new couch makes the old coffee table look like garbage. A new phone somehow makes your entire desk setup feel embarrassing. That part everyone gets right. Here's the part almost everyone gets wrong. McCracken's actual argument wasn't about objects looking outdated next to each other. It was about something he called a Diderot unity, a group of possessions that together represent a coherent story about who you are. Your stuff isn't just stuff. It's a kind of sentence your brain is constantly writing about your own identity, and every object is a word in that sentence. The straw chair, the ink-stained desk, the crooked little prints. None of those were random. Together they spelled out something specific. The writer, the man who works, the person whose room looks like the inside of his own head. Diderot's whole study, worn and mismatched as it was a sentence that made internal sense. The scarlet robe didn't just clash visually, it clashed grammatically. It didn't fit the sentence. It was a word from an entirely different vocabulary, the vocabulary of wealth and leisure, and a man with nothing urgent left to prove, dropped directly into the middle of a sentence about struggle and labor and modest brilliance. And the human brain, when it encounters an object that breaks its own internal sentence about itself, does not shrug it off. It panics, quietly and persistently, until the sentence is rewritten into something that makes sense again. Diderot didn't replace his furniture because a salesman convinced him his old stuff was ugly. There was no salesman. He replaced it because his own mind could not tolerate an identity that contradicted itself sitting in the same room. The robe forced a question his furniture had never asked him before. Who exactly are you now? And rather than sit with that question, he spent his fortune answering it with new objects until the room agreed with the robe. Picture the modern version. You buy one decent monitor arm because your neck has started filing complaints. Suddenly, your desk looks like a crime scene. The cables are everywhere. The desk itself looks like it was rescued from a curb in 2009. So you get a desk mat to cover the worst of it. Now the desk mat makes your keyboard look ancient, so the keyboard gets replaced. The new keyboard is mechanical and loud and deeply pleased with itself, and it makes your old desk chair look like a piece of medical equipment, so somehow you now own a gaming chair despite not gaming in any sense, ever. None of this was the plan. The plan was a monitor arm. But the monitor arm wasn't really an object. It was the first word of a new sentence, and your brain, without asking permission, decided the rest of the sentence needed rewriting to match. This is the mechanism almost every modern retelling skips entirely because the real version is far less convenient than the marketing villain version. It is much more comfortable to believe some outside force is doing this to you. An algorithm, an advertisement, a clever store display engineered by people who studied psychology specifically to exploit you. That version lets you off the hook. It says the problem is out there. But McCracken's own research kept pointing back to something quieter and far less escapable. This isn't a story about external manipulation. The unity your possessions form, and the discomfort you feel when one piece breaks that unity, happens whether or not anybody is advertising to you at all. You could live alone on an island with no internet, no billboards, no influencers, and the exact same mechanism would still fire the moment one object stopped matching the story you'd built around yourself. Honestly, you wouldn't even need the island to be populated by anyone else at all. Picture a castaway with exactly one coconut. He's fine. He's at peace. He has built a quiet, coherent little coconut-based identity for himself. Then a slightly nicer coconut washes up on the beach, smoother, better shaped, frankly showing off. Within the hour, the first coconut looks pathetic to him. There's no ad campaign on that island. No influencer named Coconut King 69 telling him to upgrade. Just one good coconut, and a brain that immediately started asking uncomfortable questions about the rest of his coconut collection. That story doesn't even need to be about wealth. Buy one piece of expensive workout gear and the rest of your gym bag suddenly looks like it belongs to someone less serious than you've decided to become. Get one houseplant in a beautiful ceramic pot, and every other pot in the house looks suddenly cheap and unworthy of the room. Replace one ordinary kitchen item with something sleek and well-designed, and the rest of the kitchen starts to look like it belongs to a stranger. None of this requires a single advertisement. It requires only one thing: an object that disagrees with the sentence your mind has already written about who you are. The sociologist Juliet Shore picked the idea back up decades later and pointed at something even more unsettling. The spiral doesn't really have a finish line. There is no final object that completes the sentence and lets the mind rest. Every new acquisition simply raises the bar for what the rest of the collection needs to look like to stay coherent, and that bar keeps rising for as long as you keep buying. It's less like climbing a staircase toward some clear, fixed landing, and more like climbing an escalator that quietly speeds up every time you take a step, so the top never actually gets any closer, no matter how fast you move. Diderot didn't stop after the chair, he didn't stop after the desk. He kept going until an entire fortune that should have secured his future had been rerouted into a single room, all in pursuit of a feeling of coherence that, by his own account, never actually arrived. He ended the essay poorer than the robe had any right to make him, surrounded by objects more expensive and more beautiful than anything he'd owned before, and somehow more uneasy in that room than he had ever been in the shabby one. So when did this start? Not 1986, when McCracken put a name to it. Not even fully in 1769, when Diderot sat down and tried to explain in writing what had just happened to his own life and his own money. It started the moment the robe touched his shoulders, and his brain, instantly and without his permission, ran a comparison between the story that robe was telling and the story everything else in the room had been telling for years. That comparison takes a fraction of a second. The spending it triggers can take years to fully play out, and in some cases it never really stops at all. You've felt this. Everyone has. The new item that makes an entire drawer, an entire closet, an entire room suddenly feel like it belongs to someone you used to be. The upgrade that was supposed to bring satisfaction and instead just produced a longer list of things that now look wrong standing next to it. That isn't a flaw in your willpower, and it isn't proof that some company successfully manipulated you. It's a very old, very human piece of cognitive machinery, quietly insisting that everything around you tell the same story, and growing uneasy every single time something doesn't. Diderot felt it in a French study in 1769 with nothing more advanced in the entire room than a scarlet robe in a bad mood. You'll probably feel it again this week, somewhere far smaller than a robe. In a moment, you won't even notice happening. If you want more stories like this one, the strange psychology hiding behind the things we buy, subscribe. This channel is where it all gets explained.